Hey guys, let's get into it. So hopefully you're staying nice and warm and all the good things at home. But I want to make sure that we get through our next chapter about human tissues. So I'm going to break these up into a sequence of probably 20-minute videos just so it's a little bit more digestible. But we will hit the ground running with the next chapter when I see you next time. So please make sure to review both or all, I should say, of these videos to come. Okay, so with that, let's get into it. Okay, so chapter 4, remember we just came out of chapter 3 and we were talking about how we could utilize different molecular techniques to be able to say something about the DNA that we have available at the crime scene. So now we're going to transition into human tissues. We are going to talk maybe briefly a little bit about blood, but really, again, the idea is what can these tissues tell us about what took place and how can we use this as far as forensic evidence in our investigation. So thinking through then some of the major objectives, we're going to describe some of the major tissues that we would utilize on site. We're explaining their forensic applications, and we're going to identify the key characteristics that would aid us in utilizing these tissues for forensic investigation. So just a high level to kind of bring us back to the biology and kind of the understanding of this. Remember, tissues, because this is biology-based course, we need to understand that tissue themselves is a group or arrangement of specialized cells that perform a very specialized series of functions, right? So we can look at the individual cells, but once cells start to come together to form tissues, things like the linings of things, blood is a tissue, right? Then we can say that those cells are sticking together to perform a very specific function, right? They are integrated, and then we can define specific tissue types because of that. So again, this is incredibly important because when we walk into a scene that maybe we don't have a full body or we have a very large mess that we have to sort of sift through, not only are we also looking for DNA, but we may be looking for identification of what types of tissue are we seeing, because that can tell us a little bit about what took place at the scene, but most importantly, you know, anything from wound analysis to other individuals inside of the room. So the four major classifications of tissue that we may turn to are epithelial tissue. We're going to spend a lot of time there. We'll talk a little bit about connective tissue, some aspects around muscle tissue, and nervous tissue as well. So again, epithelial, this is some of the largest as far as tissue because this covers most of the surfaces and linings of our body. And it is something that helps to form some of the inner portions of glands. Again, if you wanted to get into forensic pathology, forensic histology, you would need to identify and understand specific cell structures underneath a microscope, right? So again, you would be staining, you would be looking for the characteristics, you would be looking at the pattern and arrangements of how these cells specifically line up. What are they lining up for? What are the characteristics of them, et cetera, et cetera. So epithelial tissue being one of the largest that we're going to discuss, skin for sure. We know that it performs lots of different functions. So epithelial tissue overall can do many different things. It can provide protection, absorption, filtration. It can secrete, right? Remember in our previous slide, we stated that it can help to form the linings of things like glands, right? And glands are excreting out different things to come to the surface of the body or into the bloodstream. So again, these very tight cells that line and create this tissue could be things like skin, lining of organs. And so again, when we think about coming onto a scene, epithelial tissue can be everywhere. theoretically, right? Because it's literally from the inside of us to the outside of us. We can utilize epithelial tissue not only to pull and analyze DNA, but we can identify things like markings on individuals. We all have unique characteristics, whether that be burns, that could be specific types of bruises, that could be different chemicals one was exposed to. You know, as far as a case study, I don't know, maybe we're aware if you're sort of a true crime person, but I remember deeply this case when I was younger, and it's still unsolved to this day, which is that of JonBenet Ramsey, one of the most notorious cases out of Golden, Colorado. And so there was DNA fragments that were found underneath the fingernails of JonBenet Ramsey and inside of her underwear, but they still have not been identified. Now, of course, they based analysis against this, against every single individual that was inside of her family. And then what made that case even a little bit more complicated was she was found deceased on December 26th of 1996. But the issue is that the night before they had had a very large Christmas party. And so they were pretty well notoriously known inside of the neighborhood as being pretty well off. And JonBenet was absolutely a rising star in sort of the pageant world and circuitry. So everybody pretty much knew her inside the town. And again, you know, I don't want to give too much of the case away, even though it's not solved. It's a very interesting one. So yes, we went to the epithelial tissue that was found as she presumably was fighting back off her attacker during that time. So we now need to understand a little bit about how is the skin arranged and where are we going to based on these layers. So the skin has two major layers. We call the outermost portion of it the epidermal layer, and that is made up of 7 different layers that are continuously shed, right? And then we have the dermal layer. The dermis is made up of things like your glands. It's made up of the structures that kind of reside along the base of the skin to the fat cells, to the connective tissue that holds your skin together, to pain receptors. This is where your hair follicles are going to go in. Really, that epidermal layer, we are constantly shedding. So again, if we aren't aware, right, that dust inside of the house is built up just being shed of skin. It doesn't mean that, of course, having the windows and doors open, that it's not bringing in outside materials, or if you have a pet inside of your home, that dander. But really, what is dander? It's just the shedding of that top layer, right? You're shedding off because your skin is constantly replenishing and pushing off the old dead skin. Again, how would you know that that's taking place? If you've ever cut yourself or had any sort of injury, right? You know that eventually that skin comes back together. We'll end, especially in the next chapter, talking about wounds when there is deep, deep trauma to the skin and we form scar tissue, right? And kind of how that doesn't repair back based around that. So inside of, you know, the excretion factor of all that dermal layer from our different glands, we are excreting out sweat. Sweat is there to help balance and regulate temperature. It's also there to help regulate salt concentration inside of the blood and inside of the water, right inside of the cells of the system. So it is made up of things like urea and salts and water. And again, as that sweat comes up to the top and it evaporates, right? Thinking about the different properties of water, it takes a lot of temperature to raise the degree of water. So to move it from a liquid to a gaseous state, you are relying on that temperature change because as it wicks away and transitions into that gaseous state, it now pulls heat with it, right? So it traps the heat in that water molecule and it pulls it off at the breaking of those bonds as a transition state. Skin is, and I'm sure we know this by now, the largest organ inside of the body, which means it's got a lot of real estate to give off a lot of different aspects of this tissue for us to say something about in the criminal investigation. And again, not just DNA wise. Now we're moving into the tissues to look at, again, wounds. We're looking at burns. We're looking at all sorts of different things. So knowing this, we have to understand what are the functions of skin, and then how can this be modified or messed with, unfortunately, throughout the stages of the decomposition process, and just understanding, what can that help us to understand about what took place. So we know it's a protective barrier. So again, is it a very thin protective layer at this point, right? We know that there are areas of our bodies that are very thin in terms of our skin layer. We don't have a lot of fat for protection. But if we see that there is, festering sites of wounds or different things, right? The barrier is no longer doing its job appropriately. Was there an underlying disease state based on this? Was somebody exposed to something? Was there a pathogen around them, right? Was there a transference of disease state here? Again, temperature regulation, we found this out as we were talking through the different stages in the beginning of decomposition. That swing sort of helps to modify through the different progression stages of decomposition. We know we have sensory reception, and of course, for our forensic use, as I stated, what is taking place to the skin? Are there abrasions? Are there cuts? Are there indicative marks? We look at these things and we say somebody must have done something to this person, but sometimes it's a self-inflicted wound. It may be accidental, it may be purposeful, right? People work, in unique jobs, and, we can look at that. So as I mentioned, we have that epidermal and that dermal layer. And if we look, we can identify the different arrangements of the cell types that we have. So what would I want you to know? For our epidermal layer, we are looking at keratinized, so keratin, right? This is an important one. This is what helps to form sort of almost a waxy, rigid sort of flexibility, if you will, right, to the skin itself. But we give that the main characteristic of being keratinized. Stratified, what does stratified mean? Stratified just means that it is kind of like a brick laying pattern, right? It's not just one brick on top of the other. There's kind of offset in terms of the brick arrangement. So again, stratified. Squamous, long and flat. Squamous, squishy. That would be another way maybe to think about it. And again, epithelium. When we say epithelium, we're talking about a single cell layer. So if I follow the dots, right? Really, it's just one layer of these cells sort of touching together. They may be stacked, but if I follow them in a row, it's just one cell touching one cell, touching one cell, touching one cell, right? So at its base of what any type of epidermal layer is, or epidermis, we're looking at just a single sort of cell layer in that regard. And then for our dermal layer, really, again, we're talking about things that allow for you to feel. This is where the things around touch really exist, right? Again, sweat, nervous system, your nerves, your nerve endings, your receptors, your pain, your sensitive receptors, your temperature receptors. This is where blood vessels are going to be. All that top layer of that epidermis is just pushing up and out new skin cells to eventually make it to the top. But that epidermal layer, as I said, is keratinized. And so that's a good thing. That outer layer that's eventually going to be shed, and so that the new layer can form, is eventually going to die off and create what is called the cuticle. And again, this is good. This is a good, almost kind of waxy, flexible bendiness to it that allows for you to have this flexibility in the skin. It's not just tight and rigid, right? And so this cuticle portion tells us it can, because it is sort of this harder outer layer, it can take on impressions, right? It can be pressed upon. And over time, we can actually say something about an individual, maybe based on the lifestyle and the work that they do. So let's look at some of these pictures, right? If I'm looking at this individual, at first it may appear, right, that we're looking at something nefarious. But if I have some musicians, right, that are watching this, anybody who sort of plays music with a stringed instrument would know what these marks are very, very quickly, right? Maybe you are playing a guitar over and over and over, right? And so eventually you create calluses. You create a buildup of this sort of abrasion to the particular outer cuticle. But that can tell me about your lifestyle. That can tell me about who you are. And lifestyle, right? If I'm coming in a room and I see these things and I say, well, this person played music. Well, now I have to understand, did they play in like a classical sense? Or did they play maybe in a band late night, right? And those are kind of two different varied lifestyles. So now I'm thinking about how to approach who last saw you, so to speak. So for this, what we can see, and actually this is a combo package here, these indicative marks, which may appear like bruises, are actually for this individual where their violin sat, right? Because people have to rest. And then again, if you're playing very hard, right, it's creating pressure. You know, you're feeling very passionate about it, just the same way as if you're sliding your fingers up and down a chord or up and down strings. You need to push hard to create that resistive force to make that tone. Same thing for individuals that may be in construction, or it may be, you know, working in a space that they may be involved with chemical treatments. Maybe they work in a bakery. Maybe they are dealing with, you know, maybe they work in a research lab, whatever it may be. Your hands, right? The epidermis of your body can tell you a lot about what took place, or, you know, who you are, victim or suspect. It also can unfortunately tell us instances where maybe torture was unfortunately utilized. In this particular case, we're looking at cigarette burn marks, right? And so unfortunately, this can tell us again about lifestyle. It doesn't mean it's an always, it just means it's leading us to build the story. This also leads to this understanding that tattoo markings are incredibly important, right? Tattoos are a very personalized thing. They become extremely unique. They can make identifications of race, religion, occupation, culture, ethnicity, companionship, sexual orientation, gang affiliation. It can tell us about struggles, trials and tribulations, birth, marriage, all of this, right? You literally become an outward billboard to the world, so to speak. And again, this can help us to understand about lifestyle. It also, again, is stated, it can tell us the mental makeup, and it can also tell us about things that maybe aren't so fortunate. So things like drug addiction. As it mentioned here in this picture, right, we can see that these are track marks from a user. And sometimes, you know, users want to hide that. And so they'll go and get tattoo markings to cover up, you know, prior track usage or the ability to hide track usage currently. Excuse me. Considering this too, we also have to think about the types of dyes that are used, because there are specific tattoo artists that utilize and maybe focus on one particular style or one particular creative outlet of coloring. Right? It's an art form. And so individuals want to be known for that particular art form. It also may be indicative of, you know, maybe not the highest quality. Maybe you did get an amateur tattoo. Maybe you got something, you know, maybe it was a prison tattoo and you could only use very specific things like pen ink, when you were, behind bars. Some women and men get cosmetic tattooing. You can do things like lip liners and eyebrows. Sometimes people will do this if they've gone through severe chemo treatment. Finally, the last couple here, we have medical tattooing. Some individuals just don't even want to take the chance, right? If they are in some sort of dire need or need people to know instantaneously what's going on. Some people will actually put that tattoo of this is who I am and this is what's going on with me if I ever am non-responsive, so to speak. And then we can actually even have things called traumatic tattoos, where again, such strong force has actually caused, this usually happens in people who've been electrocuted. They get sort of a very unique pattern distribution throughout their body as the electricity basically was going through the body. Right, energy can't be created nor destroyed. It's just transferred and transformed. So electricity goes through body, bounces through body, and then must exit said body. And so what really you're seeing is basically the burning, the cauterizing of those internal tissues as the electricity moved through that person. Finally, as I had mentioned, of course, one of the biggest, most notorious ones that we absolutely look to if we have any speculation of, gang affiliation, this is a huge rite of passage. You can typically not earn your ink unless you have gone through, several trials and tribulations. But once you do, you're branded, and that's a very important marking as far as identification for forensic analysis. Last but not least, as far as kind of the tattooing goes, right, this also can identify personal preferences. We may assume that this is always going to be affiliated with sort of gangs, but this can tell us about an individual. This can tell us about their lifestyle choices. This can tell us about affiliations of other people that we may need to turn to that may know information, right? And so again, these were examples that I found of Nazi or Nazi ideology in Australia. Some of these look probably pretty familiar. Okay, the last little bits here that I'll talk about with epithelial, and then I'll end this video and move to the next one. Scarring, as I had mentioned, that outer layer really can tell us something. It can provide, scars are markings. You can have a birthmark scar. You can have, unique things that were, again, congenital, that were from birth. But scarring can also tell us again about lifestyle. Unfortunately, in that upper picture there, this is indicative of a self-cutter. This is an individual who self-harms, unfortunately. And again, this tells us about mental state. It can tell us about, what do we need to maybe look into? Is it medical records? Were they ever taken into the system before? Just lots of different things can be stated through the epidermis, right? So again, very unique to you, how you heal, how you, lay down the tissue to repair your skin as far as scarring is very unique to you. It can indicate past injuries, surgeries, right, or abuse. Surgeries are really important. I can, if I can't identify you because maybe I don't have a head, or maybe a head is, there's nothing there to identify, but I have, some pieces that are sort of there that, show scarring of some sort. And maybe I find, medical devices. That medical device is going to have some version of a ID number, a registration number from the hospital. And right now I can just follow that trail back. Again, where we find scars, these are going to be places where it is now, that new tissue layer cannot come up through the epidermis. It is damaged, hence the scarring. So this is devoid of hair follicles, sweat glands. And this, again, just makes it extremely distinguishable from the surrounding skin within that area. Okay, I'm gonna end here. And I am going to pick up in the next video.